A miraculous tale of survival for children in the jungles of Colombia after a small plane crash. Also, the recent crash of the Citation jet that overflew Washington, D.C. has created one common question. Why was there only one pilot on board? We're going to find out why on this episode of Taking Off. Hi, I'm Dan Milliken, and before we get into why the Citation could only have a single pilot, I want to thank our sponsors like Jerry Clemens of ClemensInsurance.net. When I switched over to Jerry, he was able to get my insurance discounted by 4 figures because, well, he knows the rules. Check him out if you want to save some insurance money. He'll tell you if he can't, but most likely he'll be able to help you. And more on our sponsors at the end of this video. Okay. On May 1st, a Cessna 206 stationary took off out of Colombia as a passenger charter carrying 3 adults and 4 children, ages 13, 9, 4, and 11-month-old baby. They were en route over the Colombian rainforest. The pilot reported that his engine was running at idle, and he was declaring an emergency and looking for a field to land in. 15 minutes later, the pilot informed ATC that the engine was back and he was climbing back to altitude. 11 minutes after that, the pilot reported he had lost the engine and he was following a river looking for a place to put down. The aircraft struck some trees, causing the engine to break away, falling nose first through the trees to the ground. And on May 15th, 14 days later, the wreckage was found with the 3 adult bodies, but no sign of the children. The Colombian government sent out soldiers to try and find the children, and the entire nation was captivated by the search. And then finally, on June 9th, the children were found 40 days after the crash. They had survived off jungle fruit, mainly due to the 13-year-old's direction. The 4 are part of an indigenous tribe there and knew what they could eat. But when they were found, they were all very weak. And they are expected to recover and are at a Bogota hospital. What an incredible story. All right, on June 4th, a Cessna Citation jet, a CE-560, otherwise known as a Citation 5, crashed in mountainous terrain in Virginia. It had taken off from Tennessee, flown over its destination in Long Island, and returned on a direct line to its takeoff location, but crashed short of returning. And when the jet was returning, its path took it directly over Washington, D.C., and though news reports stated the airplane had violated national airspace, that's not true. The jet was well above any restricted airspace, but it was unresponsive, and fighter jets, F-16s, were scrambled and sonic booms heard all over the eastern seaboard. The plane had become unresponsive to ATC early in the flight. And when the F-16s intercepted, they reported seeing the pilot slumped over the controls and to the right. Multiple channels have done reports on this horrible crash, so I'm not going to dive into that, other than to say the quick jump to the decompression conclusion is a bit premature. We don't know if this was a hypoxia event like the Payne-Stewart crash. It could be a medical event with the pilot. We just don't know at this point. All right, on board the Citation, owned by John Rumpel, was the pilot Jeff Hefner, as well as Rumpel's adoptive daughter, Adina Azarian, and her 2-year-old daughter, and the girl's nanny, Evadne Smith. All 4 have perished in this tragic accident. If the plane had had an emergency decompression like the Payne-Stewart jet, then having 2 pilots might not have changed the outcome, though it doubled the chances of a pilot donning the emergency mask and being able to get the plane to lower altitude before anyone passed out. But if the pilot suffered a medical event, then undoubtedly a second pilot would have been able to fly and land the plane safely. And I've seen on the comments on social media, people wondering why there was only one pilot and what the rules are. Well, this video is going to address that question. I'm going to speak to the question in general terms and not get too FAA technical with the language. Some of what I'm about to say might be a bit of a generalization, like to start. Whether a plane has to have 2 pilots instead of 1 is generally determined by the plane itself. When a plane is manufactured, it might have as a requirement 2 pilots or 1 pilot. Again, generally speaking, it's often based on the weight of the plane, usually over 12,500 pounds. Specifically, the way the FAA looks at it, many planes are certified for two-pilot operation and when over 12,500 pounds performing air transport duties. To get into that a little more, I'm going to turn to someone who knows jets and has experience with the Citation 560. Christy?
Hi, Dan. Yes, those of you who have followed my journey know that I flew corporate planes before I went to the airlines. And you know that my favorite was the Citation 560. To look at why some jets allow for a single pilot versus a two-pilot crew, you have to go back to 1977. See, up until that point, the FAA required all jets to be operated by two pilots. But in 1977, Cessna came out with the Citation 1 SP, aka the single pilot variant of the Citation 1. To get this approved by the FAA, Cessna had to prove that this plane could be handled by a single pilot and not get overworked. Part of the requirements were having a boom microphone, which, believe it or not, weren't super common in those days. And you also had to have a transponder ident button on the yoke because back then you would have to ident on almost every controller handoff. And of course, all gears and controls had to be accessible from the left seat. There were also some autopilot requirements and hands-free communication required to be available. The FAA also set the threshold for single pilot operations. The airplane must not weigh more than 12,500 pounds max takeoff weight. The Citation 1 SP fit perfectly into that category, weighing in at just under 12,000 pounds. After meeting all of the requirements set forth, the FAA gave them their blessing and their certification for the single pilot jet. This early version of the Citation series was a hit and spun off many successors. However, as newer planes were being developed to accommodate customer demand, they started exceeding that 12,500 pound weight limit. With the advent of newer avionics and higher tech resources available to pilots, these newer, bigger airplanes were also easing the pilot workload, which put the FAA in a pickle. They didn't want to set the precedent of allowing larger aircraft to operate a single pilot, but it was clear that some of these planes could be operated just as safely and effectively as their single pilot predecessors. A few examples are the King Air 350, the Citation CJ series, or the Phenom 300. They were larger than their predecessors, but flew almost identically. So the FAA made a compromise, the single pilot waiver. This allowed for qualified commercial pilots to get an exemption to fly these larger aircraft as a single pilot. Prerequisites usually include a minimum of 1,000 hours total time and 500 hours of turbine time, plus be already type rated in the aircraft that you wish to become a single pilot in. If you meet those prerequisites, then you'd attend a type rating course specifically for the single pilot waiver. There's a check ride involved, just like any other certification or rating, including a set of maneuvers and a full motion simulator. So there's definitely a process to it and a series of checks and balances to make sure single pilot operators carry the appropriate training. And no, this is not something that the airlines can do. All Part 121 carriers, in other words, all of the airlines, are required to crew their airplanes with a minimum of 2 pilots, and sometimes more depending on how long the flight is. Of course, this usually pertains to the very long international flights. And I know there have been articles floating around saying that the FAA might change to single pilot in the airlines one day, but I honestly don't see that happening anytime soon. But that's a topic for another episode. Just know that if it ever did happen, there would be a lot of red tape to get through. All right, Dan, back to you.
Thanks. Can the flight be successful with one pilot? Absolutely. Heck, large drones can be flown and landed safely with no pilot. Any plane today can be flown and landed safely with one pilot in normal circumstances, but stuff happens and workload can suddenly jump way up, and a shared workload is more manageable, more safe. And that's the primary reason for 2 pilots, safety. With 2 pilots, you'll have one pilot who's doing the flying, and the other pilot, usually referred to as the pilot monitoring, will work radios, monitor systems, and assist the pilot flying. 2 pilots decrease workload. They decrease the stress, they decrease the fatigue at things that have killed in the past. And what's the primary reason for a 2-pilot plane to get that FAA waiver and run with one pilot? Usually economics. Having 2 pilots can increase the operational costs of the flight. Not only do you have to pay the second pilot, you have to put them up, you have to provide food, transport, all that stuff. So some owners will push for a waiver for a single pilot operation. Which, by the way, while the Citation that crashed on June 4th was a small jet that can have the single pilot waiver, we don't know yet for sure that that was the case in this specific accident. This flight was either flown under the single pilot waiver or simply flown single pilot without the waiver. We don't know yet. When the NTSB issues the prelim report in the next week or two, it will clear up that question. In light of the pilot shortage, which is only predicted to get worse in the next few years, there's been a loud voice for single pilot usage, while some even advocating it for the Part 121, the airlines level. But again, really, the question of one or two pilots is a question of economics versus safety. Personally, as a passenger on an airliner, I'd feel a whole lot better and would pay a little bit more to have that second pilot on the flight deck. Just my opinion. What do you think? Leave your comments below. Okay, so to recap this whole single pilot versus two pilot issue, the TLDR version is that planes over 12,500 pounds will require two pilots, but a few of those can receive a single pilot waiver, and that pilot must earn a single pilot rating. It comes down to safety versus economics. And that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching. And please support us by subscribing and by using our sponsors' products and services like ColtonTakingOff.com for the residential mortgage, or Z-Vision, the brightest landing and takeoff lights in the industry. My favorite camera and phone mounts, 67 designs at 67D.com. MPSProtects.com, private security elevated, and of course, Flying Eyes, the best glasses and sunglasses for comfort under headsets and helmets. Take care, and remember, superior judgment trumps superior skill. We'll see you next time.